There is a common narrative put forward in some Afrocentric circles that suggests the ancient Hebrews described in the Old Testaments were black Africans. However, upon close examination of both archaeological evidence and biblical text itself, this claim does not stand up to scrutiny.
There is a giant misunderstanding about the Hebrews and Jewish people in general when it comes to the history of the Israelites. Of course, some people don't understand that a lot of people in Israel came via way of Sumeria and others through Egypt. And then another thing they don't understand is that these people of Israel, the Israelites, were not stuck in Israel and they moved. And part of their movement was in the direction of Yemen, creating Yemeni Jews who, on returning to Israel, were carrying some black DNA as much as they were carrying any other DNA. And these same Yemeni who fused with Ethiopians became part of a greater Israeli historical story, which is why Israel allows black people from Ethiopia to return. And then, of course, there's the biblical claim, which allows many other black people from around the world to return to Israel because there's a difference between biblical narrative and historical narrative. Now, in terms of who are the real Israelites and all this other stuff, that question is one that can only be answered by evidence.
Let's start with what we know about their geographical context. The land of ancient Canaan and Israel, where the Hebrews originally lived according to the Bible, are located in the Middle East region, not sub-Saharan Africa.
To this day, people still speak about places in the Middle East as if they were so inaccessible to Africans. But we do know from the Bible and from earlier writers, we can go back, real back in history, and it will tell us about the number of Africans that went to places in the Middle East, which is why we can't take all the DNA evidence seriously. Because if it continues to ignore black DNA, then there is something flawed in the way that they're collecting their data. But let's read this little piece that shows us that quote unquote sub Saharan Africans had direct access to Israel and worshipped at the same time. But an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, Arise and go toward the south on the way that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert region. And he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch, a state officer of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was over all her treasure, who had come to Jerusalem to worship, was returning and sitting in his chariot, was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, Go near and join thyself to this chariot. And Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet. And he said, Understandest thou then what thou art reading? And he said, How could I, except someone shall guide me? And he besought Philip to come up and sit with him. So we have an Ethiopian in Gaza, which by the way is hilarious because some people think that Gaza is like a made up state, like it was made up yesterday. A Ethiopian in Gaza, literally next to Jerusalem, who went to Israel, as it says, to try and pray to the Jewish God, seeking someone who could help him in his prayer. And this isn't even mentioning Zerah the Ethiopian or any other Ethiopians that are mentioned within the Bible, which again, if you remove these Ethiopians, then what you're saying is The people in the past guessed, the people in Israel guessed that there was such a thing as an Ethiopian, and they guessed that they lived in certain places around the world, and they guessed that they lived in Israel as well. That they just made that all up for no reason is weird.
This region is considered to be part of Asia, and the indigenous population there were historically have been described as having consistent with West Asiatic Semitic ancestry.
There is an obviously good debate that could happen about this, but just declaring something does not make it true. You can't just say people have said that it makes sense that people in this region are consistent with this, because there's so many candidates you could choose, and you could draw routes to how they could get to that region. Now, I want to remind people that in ancient Egypt, this is a true story based on writing. In ancient Egypt, during the time of Ramses, the people in the north, so we're talking about in Western Asia, sent a letter to Ethiopia so that they could surround Egypt and take over. Meaning, this is an even older evidence that people from Ethiopia had contact with people in Western Asia. So again, there's no isolation.
The archaeological excavations of burial sites from biblical era Canaanite and early Israelite periods have uncovered human remains that correlate anatomically with modern Middle Eastern population. Cranial and osteological analysis confirms these ancient peoples grouped mostly closely with Caucasian or West Asian references sample and
See, but that's a different argument again. And I'm not one of these people who claims that there is absolutely no way that there would have been Caucasians in Israel. I mean, I know there were some. The Greeks were in Israel. So there is definitely a movement of multiple people. Now, here's the thing, some people don't actually understand sometimes my opinion. The reason why I don't like the multiracial or multicultural theory of Egypt is because it doesn't make sense if it doesn't apply to parts of Asia. Why does the multiracial theory of the world stop in North Africa? Believe it or not, I do believe that those civilizations were multiracial at some point, but it didn't stop in Asia. It got into Israel and places like that. And how do we know? Well, they write about it. Everybody writes about it. Every single person writes about it.
not sub-Saharan Africa. The Bible itself also contains no description of the ancient Israelites as having dark skin. In fact, there are examples where skin color distinguished Hebrews from neighboring African people like the Cushites.
So clearly, he's never read the Bible, because there are multiple verses in the Bible that describe a lot of Israelites as having dark skin. And in fact, the word that he uses, like if we read here, and Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman that he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And another verse, I am dark but comely, daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the tents curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me, because I am swarthy, because the sun has tanned me. The sons of my mother were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyard. My vineyard, my own, I have not kept. Tell me, O thou whom my soul loves, where thou feedest thy flock, where thou makest it to lie down at noon. For why should I be as one that is veiled? And then, of course, the mention of Zerah the Ethiopian with an army of 1,300,000 chariots, and he came to Marishah. Then Asa went out to meet him, and blah blah blah. They had a war. more Ethiopians in Israel.
The Song of Songs mentioned the beloved having light brown complexion consistent with Semitic phenotypes, and slavery of black people was not commonly practiced in ancient Canaanite or Israelite culture unlike neighboring Egypt.
I just gave you multiple examples of Ethiopians in the Bible, so I don't know what you're going to do with that information.
Linguistic and comparative analysis of Proto-Semitic languages like ancient Hebrews also trace their origin to the Fertile Crescent, North Africa.
Not that it matters because languages can travel from one place to another, even if they don't belong to the original people. But the language that is spoken by the Israelites is Afroasiatic and it's thought to have come from Africa. Afroasiatic is thought to come from Africa. Now, I know some people are still going to dispute this because there is a isolationist theory or an isolation theory about Africans that is ever growing.
And written histories from neighboring empires consistently describe the ethnic makeup of the region's inhabitants similarly to modern population.
Oh, yeah, that's how they describe them. Give me an example of this description. How exactly, if you're all looking the same, so if you're all Middle Eastern people, what is this description that they give that is so obvious that they're talking about the modern population? And by the way, do you know that the modern population of Israel, most of them does not necessarily come from Israel? A lot of them are Yemeni Jews from Yemen. A lot of them are from Europe, and then a lot of them are from Africa.
While the ancestries of some individual Israelite or ancient Jewish groups could have included some small intermarriage and genetic influence from neighboring population over time, the cumulative evidence simply does not substantiate portrayal of Israelites as having been predominantly of original black Africans. Historically and archaeologically,
Okay, but that's a different claim altogether. To claim that they weren't the predominant is different than claiming that they weren't there in Israel.
sound approach recognized the ancient Hebrews as indigenous Levantine West Asian based on comprehensive analysis of available evidence. Also, genetic studies of modern Jewish population shows their closest genetic relatives to be other Levantine groups such as the Druze, Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrians, and not Africans. Their
Citation needed.
DNA clusters with ancient remains found in the Levant, and that is only the Mizrahi Jews. The ancient Egyptians who did have contact and depictions of other Africans portrayed Israelites and Canaanites in a distinct manner consistent with local West Asian rather than sub-Saharan groups.
Again, not fully understanding the context of Israel in the past. Remember, there is a number of Israelites who moved into Nubia in Egypt during the time of the Romans and people like that. And then they moved back and forth within Israel during times of conflict. People have no idea about these realities. And so they make claims which are not fully historically represented. And that thing of like the drawings from Egypt of Jews, there's no real drawings of Egypt from ancient Egypt of Jews. Those are Aimu, which we know were probably people living as far up as Syria and places like that, not necessarily Jews.
References to skin tones and complexions in the Bible are more consistent with description used for other Semitic groups like the Arameans and Amorites inhabiting in the Levant region at the time. And the anthropological analysis of cranial features from excavated Israelite remains matches nearest to local Bronze Age, Iron Age Canaanite groups, not more generalized African typologies.
The problem with this video is that it's too broad in its attack of black Africans. If he was attacking specifically people who said that it's impossible for anyone from the Middle East to move into the Middle East, or even people from Europe to move into the Middle East in places like Israel a long time ago, then I'd understand. But it seems he's going back and forth between the Bible never mentions Ethiopians and the Ethiopians weren't the majority in Israel.
The biblical text locates the Israelites as originating in the Fertile Crescent, migrating from Mesopotamia through Canaan. Their
Yeah, but do you know that there were people in Israel prior to any migration, except if you're talking about people, literally some of the oldest African migrants to Israel, or some of the oldest in history. We're talking upwards of 50,000 years ago. So to talk about this recent Levantine movement, it removes the real context that there were always people in that region.
written traditions and other artifacts culturally associate them with ancient Near Eastern societies. Historical
And African societies like ancient Egypt.
record from foreign empires like Assyria, Babylonia consistently portray the ancient ethnic populations of Israel and Judah as one among the various West Asian groups of the region. If Israelites have been predominantly sub-Saharan African in origin, this will be anomalous among archaeologically known groups in the ancient Near East with essentially unbroken cultural continuity since prehistory. In
Well, why should that be the case when we know there's several places in history? I mean, do you even know that there's still yet another group that is to come later after the ancient Egyptians called the Indo-Europeans, who would play a huge role in the Middle East, India, and even later on places like Yemen and North Africa? If you take these groups into consideration, it doesn't make sense that the groups should remain consistent.
summary, while assertions of ancient Black Hebrews can seem appealing from some perspective, a more objective examination demonstrates that they lack support from the fields of archaeological, linguistics, and textual historical analysis. The ethnic identity and geographic context of biblical era Israelite corresponds unambiguously with the ancient Near Eastern populations, not sub-Saharan African ones. That's it for today's video.
You know what's funny? The position that Israelites are Asiatic, there's actually a lot of strong evidence in that direction that he could have brought up, but it seems like he doesn't know any of that information. He just asserts it and then moves on, which makes it very easy for me to show you that there is definitely people of African ancestry who were in Israel from the earliest times. I guess the video is finished, according to him. Let me say one more thing. Israelites are not glued to Israel. They don't have to stay in Israel forever. They did move around the continents. They even had an empire that stretched a long distance. They had communication with Sudanese people. They had multiple influences on Ethiopia, and Ethiopia had influences on them. This is the reality of these regions, including places that were not Israel itself, like Yemen, like Saudi Arabia, and even as far as the Levant. Searching for evidence, just like the new study of DNA in Egypt, by ignoring the reality of these regions, will always result in holes that will leave people like me and others doubting the perspective of the so-called researchers. So again, they need to address these very realistic communication lines.